Hi, I'm Nicole. I am a Senior Policy Advisor in the Wellbeing Government Focus Area at the Centre for Policy Development. Welcome to our session, how wellbeing budgets or frameworks are transforming outcomes across each state and the Commonwealth. I want to start by acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to their continuing culture and to elders past and present. I understand the name Canberra originates from the Ngunnawal word Canberry, which means meeting place, which feels very appropriate for being the capital and for what we're doing here today. So I want to start by introducing each of our panel members. I'll give a fairly quick introduction, but encourage you to read the program for more details on their backgrounds because they're really fascinating. So we have Eleanor Williams, the Managing Director of the Australian Centre for Evaluation within Treasury. She has responsibility for the Measuring What Matters framework. We have Xuan Deng, the Director of Performance Budgeting Framework at the New South Wales Treasury. We have Matt Donoghue, the Director of the Early Intervention and Investment Reform Team at the Department of Treasury and Finance in Victoria. And we have Clift, Senior Director of Wellbeing Evidence, Insights and Budgeting at the ACT Government's Wellbeing Branch. So we'll get everyone up to give a 5 to 7 minute presentation, and then we'll have at least 20 minutes for questions. So Eleanor, I'll get you to take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to give you the very briefest kind of summary of the Measuring What Matters framework. I'm conscious there's a lot of people in the room who actually know a bit about this already and have some reasonably strong opinions about it. We also have a couple of members of our Measuring What Matters team here as well. We've got Luke, Fedora and Suzanne. Don't put your hands up in case anyone's a couple of people said to me they'd like to meet the team at some point, so this is the team. So, in terms of what Measuring What Matters is, it is Australia's first wellbeing framework, as this slide says, released in July 2023, so it's just had its second birthday. And in that year we had both a statement and the online dashboard launched. The online dashboard's managed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So the framework really aims to both help understand what matters most to Australians and tell us how we're tracking over time. So it's a real monitoring tool around wellbeing. Now, in terms of the development of the framework, it was launched in July 2023. There was sort of a 12-month lead-in to get there, and it consisted of two big consultation processes. So the first one, as this slide shows, 165 submissions, really trying to think about the community views on what matters, starting to get a real sense of what those domains should be, what sort of measures are relevant. Built on these emerging themes, there's a second phase, which had 120 public submissions, and really led to some community conversations and feedback about the emerging themes that were on the table, and then it was launched in July. So it's a pretty whirlwind process for this sort of national framework, but reasonably thorough, and I think a lot of the key stakeholders are really deeply in the mix for those two stages of consultation. Now this slide, I absolutely don't expect you to be able to read, but we just wanted to give you a bit of a sense, particularly as you'll get the slides later, of what the 5 domains are, and you can certainly go to the Measuring What Matters website and get a sense of this as well. We've got 5 domains: healthy, secure, sustainable, cohesive and prosperous. So I think they'll all sort of resonate in terms of the sort of spaces that most wellbeing frameworks cover, which cover sort of effectively the big policy areas, so health, justice, environment, that community cohesion and security, and prosperous around the economic outcomes. So really trying to capture that full spectrum. And this is just a little picture of what the annual dashboard update looks like. So it gives you, under those 5 domains, there's 50 measures. And you can see a graph sort of like this. It gives you a sense of the trajectory. Some of these graphs were used in the opening session in Jackie Shermer's presentation. So there's 50 indicators there. Now that's my very diplomatic, here's what Measuring What Matters is and how it works and the basics of what you need to know about it. And I just wanted to sort of touch on a couple of the big picture conversations that are happening in here. And I think we've got these really strong foundations to work from. We've got the measures in place, we've had a community consultation, we've got a sense of the community priorities. But there's sort of 2 big tasks going forward. So one is how we embed this in government. So part of that is how you get it into the systems and processes and particularly into the decision making. But another part of that is how we deepen and broaden the measurement. So I think for anyone who's had a real look under the hood at these measures, they're a very diplomatic collection. So you've gone through those community consultation, we've heard from the community what they think are important, and we've picked some indicators that relate to that democratic process. But as a decision-making framework and tool, it's got some gaps in it, it's got some space in it. So I think there is work to kind of deepen and broaden the measures that we track over time. And that's a maturity process. And I think that's probably to be expected in any national process like this. It will take some time to pick up the more detailed material underneath that. Now, the other one that comes up a lot in these spaces is the continuing the national conversation. And I do think that's a collective task. But I do think we've got to get the timing and the process right for that. So if we went again now, we'd almost be consulting, like the main thing you want to not do is duplicate that initial process where we went out and sort of blue skies said what's important to you. What I think we need to do is try and move on the conversation to sort of say, okay, we've had the 50 indicators, they've started to be useful in certain ways, reflect on that and think about what needs to happen with those indicators to give them even more utility for a decision-making and a community reflection process. So a couple of big tasks there. And then just the final reflection, because this really is just an opening snapshot. I do think we've got a really lucky bit of context. So this is the Treasurer's baby. It's got a really strong advocate in a Treasurer who's just been re-elected, looks pretty safe for at least one term, probably 2 terms. And we've got a lot of other kind of leaders in government who are equally passionate about a series of related kind of priorities. And they won't always use the terminology wellbeing, but they're interested in how you lift people's experience and satisfaction and all the sorts of measures that we do think are important. So we've got a lot of leaders in place. And I think you're seeing this in the major reform priorities. I think the reform priorities of this government actually align really, really well with measuring what matters, even if it's not through an explicit connection. It wasn't like those decisions were made because we looked at measuring what matters and we invested in them. But things like reform of the care system, improving quality and access, work to increase the supply of housing, work on the climate transition, focus on early childhood. These are all important components of the wellbeing agenda. So I think we are making solid progress in spaces that are important. So while I can see that we've got a really big journey to take this framework to maturity, I guess I just wanted to say I think we've got a lot of reasons for optimism, given there's so many people, including a lot of people in this room, pulling in the same direction. And I think it is really helpful today to see this alongside the work that's happening at state and territory level, because that's really what the end state would need to look like. If you think about the national conversation we're having, it's so important that it flows down to both state and local government to make sure it all rolls out right down to the community level. So with that, I'll hand over.
Hi everyone, I'm Xuan. I'm from New South Wales Treasury, and today I'm here to give you a very quick recap of where we've been and a couple of slides about where we'd like to take this going forward. Just like to second my acknowledgement that we are on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today. What is the framework? I'm sure most of you are familiar with wellbeing frameworks. The one thing I wanted to highlight is, in the case of New South Wales, we have both a wellbeing layer, so we've got the wellbeing metrics very similar to the Commonwealth at the state level, but we also have the performance layer that's built into that. And the reason is because we, as a state government, have some very specific and direct service delivery responsibilities, and the government is very interested in marrying up what they do to deliver those services, hospitals, schools, etc., and seeing the linkages between those services and how they contribute to wellbeing. So that's why we have this kind of pyramid where at the top layer we have the wellbeing themes, and we've got 8 of them, so 3 extra to the Commonwealth that talk to those service delivery responsibilities. We have defined 28 outcomes that the government has signed up for collectively as here are the things that we want to achieve. And we have performance indicators that track those outcomes, and that's where the service delivery link comes in. And then beneath all of that, we have a whole bunch of government programs and policies where we've said to our departments and agencies, we expect that you will have much more detailed data and indicators that track how you're going in delivering those services. We, as Treasury, at the centre of government, we are just collecting a subset of that and presenting that both publicly, outward-facing through our budget paper reporting, but also internal to government. We do regular performance updates for our cabinet, for our ERC, as a way of giving them more timely updates on how things are tracking and giving them a sense of, are we in the right track or on the right trajectory for the key things that they told us and the community have told us that they care about. In June this year, we released our first performance and wellbeing statement for New South Wales as part of our budget papers. This is actually the third time that we've done some kind of product in the budget paper. Last year, we put out, as part of the budget paper, some consultation, really just highlighting some potential indicators and getting feedback through that. We also, last year, had a parliamentary inquiry process. We did get roughly about 40 public submissions and ideas about how we can embed wellbeing into decision making. So that was quite useful. We haven't gone out to do lots and lots of public kind of grassroots consultation. We've done a little bit, but we didn't really at the time have a mandate to do a huge process. So I think, yeah, that conversation about the national conversation, that definitely can be expanded to a state and territory level as well. I'm sure there will be lots of questions about where to from here, but just to give you a very quick snapshot of the things that we are currently working on. The first dot point there is we do already in New South Wales have a way of embedding some of the framework's features into decision-making processes, and as a Treasury, one of the biggest levers we have is the budget process itself. So there are particular kind of times in the budget cycle, in the budget year, where we are asking questions of agencies around the proposals that they're giving us, the things that they'd like to do. How does that relate to the outcomes? Which of the performance indicators do they think they will make a difference for? And even just the discipline of asking them to think about the outcomes in their corporate plan processes as well. So there's a few different touch points where we're starting to build that discipline and that habit of thinking about outcomes and wellbeing as normal parts of business for government. The second dot point there is we think that the public accountability mechanism of reporting is really important. Chatham House rules, but you're probably not going to be surprised if you do read the budget paper. It doesn't give you the full picture. So we have roughly 100 indicators that we as Treasury are tracking. You're not going to see 100 of those every year in the budget paper. We were initially thinking that, that would be a really good thing for public accountability. But what we then learned and realised is that every budget paper is the baby of the treasurer of the day, and they really drive what goes in there. So they want to tell the story particular to that budget narrative. So we don't really have too much control over what ends up going out. But I think that we will certainly keep pushing for maximum kind of transparency. However, the data that is reported in the budget papers, that is also on opendata.newsouthwales. So even though we don't have a dashboard, there is a public-facing website to see the underlying data. The next one there around internal government reporting and budget decision-making, I've kind of touched on a little bit. I think there's definitely a lot of work to do here where there is a certain amount of, proposals that come through which don't have that maturity level of having the right evidence, at least from Treasury economist standards, having the right kind of program logics and evaluation plans to see, does something work? How will we know if it works or not? So I think that's something that we imagine will take time to build as well. And that's why we are really keen as a central agency to provide those tools and guidance. So for example, New South Wales already has existing guidance on how to do a business case or how to do a cost-benefit analysis. We're now working with our internal colleagues and agency colleagues to give guidance and practical examples of how you would think about wellbeing in particular instances and what are the right types of projects where we really want to see that, because it may not be proportional effort to do it for everything. So I think that's a really interesting piece of work that we're embarking on as well. And lastly, that point about community engagement, I think for us, maybe a little bit similar to what Eleanor was saying, we don't see, at least from our kind of time perspective, greatest value in going out and having a very high-level, broad conversation about what's important, even though there are benefits to that. What we're really interested in at the moment is getting a much deeper understanding of community preferences for almost that second tier of within a particular outcome, take any outcome, let's say housing, do we really know what housing preferences do the community have and do the cohorts within communities have? So, you know, there's a lot of press in the papers about housing affordability and home ownership, especially for young people being an issue. We don't actually know for sure what is it about home ownership that is the most important to a young person. So is it that they really need security of tenure? Is that more important than having a backyard? Or the elements or the components of what's important under a particular outcome, we're quite interested in learning more about that. So if there's any researchers out there who think this might be something that we can partner on, please come and have a chat to me afterwards. But I just wanted to note that on community engagement, there are specific policy topics that we'd really like to work with others on to get a better understanding rather than doing something very high level. Thank you. I'll leave that there.
We'll get Matt Donoghue up now.
G'day, and thanks for having me again. I would also just like to connect to the earlier acknowledgement and pay my respects to traditional owners and all that as well. Today I'll talk you through a bit of the background and where the Victorian framework came from, a bit of how it works, and then a bit of how it works in budget, and some sort of lessons and reflections that might be useful to those in the room. Also welcome any questions you have, of course. Our framework started with a request from the Treasurer. No surprises. The Treasurer came to us and said acute spending's growing well above revenue growth and that gap's getting wider. I'm talking to the Treasurer, but also Treasury heard this as well. Feedback was given from the community organisation sector and specific organisations about the lack of a scale-up pathway for programs that had evidence they were working. That was very clear from the outset. And we had also been trialling social impact bonds and had a few going in Victoria as well. And there was a lot of value placed on the outcome measurement in that and the rigour that could provide, particularly whether that rigour could be provided to the budget process. So within that, the solution that we presented to the Treasurer and the Treasurer was a framework that was embedded within the budget process and builds on that. So really tries to put people-focused outcomes at the centre of the budget. I'd love to talk for more time about this, but maybe just call it budget plus. It's everything that's in budget plus two things. One, you need to, if you're submitting a new program, you need to quantify outcomes for the client that will reflect effectiveness of the program so we can track them over time. And two, you need to quantify the impacts on the broader system, noting a lot of vulnerable cohorts have impacts across responsibilities of multiple departments, not just the submitting department. For example, homelessness would be submitted from our housing department, but also has interactions with the health department and the justice department and the court services. Again, love to talk about this more, but all the conversations we start with departments when they're developing budget bids around program logic. Who is this program aiming to help? How does it help them? How much does it help them? And it's a very common thread in that. And I think those conversations have grown more mature over time and are a good reflection of the changing culture that we've had in Victoria. This one is, this green graph is one of my favourite, and it's by two of my favourite economists and two favourite people as well, and Catherine Trebek and Warwick Smith. And the green graph really shows the sequence of wellbeing in government. And more than I think it can interact with the frameworks we're talking about today, and I think there's a place for top-down system macro frameworks that tell you where the economy is at, where people are in the economy, where need is greatest, and identifying root causes. And then the bottom-up sort of program level work that shows you how to most effectively address those root causes and track that those programs are effective. And I think there is a national conversation, and I think we're very excited to watch unfold at the moment, with the Productivity Commission speaking yesterday about National Prevention Framework, which seems like a great complement to the great work you're already doing, Eleanor. So in the budget process, I like this graph as well. I'm an economist, I do love a good graph, but it could also be presented as a list. So in budget process, we provide government advice based on evidence of impact, and that allows us to rank from maybe 100 to 1 based on just on evidence, and that's how we provide our advice to the early intervention framework. The two axes are the two criteria I mentioned earlier for the EAF, the two pluses in the budget plus, the focus on outcomes and the evidence to support them, and the estimated magnitude of avoided costs over 10 years. I'd love to spend more time about this. This is the sort of a slide on the incentives. I think at a high level, the early intervention framework rewards evidence. It also includes reputational incentives in its design, as well as financial incentives to try and change behaviour and the development of new proposals and new ideas. Here's just a snapshot of the journey of the early intervention framework. I think the key message here is to start with, it didn't happen all at once. It started small and sort of testing, and it took us time in the first year or two to work out the framework, and I think we had a plan for that, but it didn't happen all at once. And there was some comments around serving government as well. What has happened, and I think it's a positive, as governments become more comfortable with the methodologies and the application, and we've been able to get actuals to verify and validate the framework more, we've been able to convince government, and government supported more transparency in the methodologies. So where we are now, at a program level, there is a benefit cost, or at least large components of a benefit costs at an initial level in budget papers. That includes how many people an individual program is supporting, but as well as some of the expected outcomes they will receive, the fiscal benefits over 10 years that will be generated from successfully helping those individuals, and some of the economic benefits, some of which accrue to the Commonwealth, some of which accrue to the states, that we also publish. So lessons, I think this is just a little evaluation. So most of the program, it was a leap of faith initially for the government. We could reduce a lot of the risk by planning and thoughtfulness and having a steady approach, but we didn't have actual information. We had a hope that early interventions would be effective if they were funded, and thankfully a few years on we can say most have been effective. Certainly there's still some that don't report where it's a bit uncertain, but I think that's a really good outcome, so we can say that with confidence. Also, government has received back savings through the framework, which was also part of that initial genesis of closing the gap between growing acute and revenue growth. The last point here, the system in terms of balance of upstream and downstream investments or acute investment, it's still on a journey, but there has been 5 steps, 5 budgets, 5 increases in funding levels, but over the last years towards upstream relative to acute. Acute is still the majority of base funding though. And here's just some learnings from the time. Hopefully they're useful. I think the framework needed to be useful for government. Like we, thankfully, when we implemented the framework, we'd had the same treasurer for a number of years and sort of knew how they like to operate, what they needed in terms of advice and budget decision making, and made it useful so it did change their decisions. I think that'll be different in every jurisdiction, but it needs to be useful. At its core, I think the framework tells a better story of the person and how a person is helped through government funding. I think that is the most powerful element. I think there's also a recognition that more evidence is beneficial for all, not just Treasury, but departments and providers, and if we can share that and build a collective evidence base, that's great value. As a Treasury, I think there's a natural suspicion when we're in the room, and that's part of the dynamic and the contested sort of budget game that exists. But I think feedback loops, that we act with consistency and integrity and provide back our advice, and you can see that transparency have really helped break down some of those barriers and provide a clear expectation of how we're going to operate. Even though I showed you a bubble diagram earlier, knowing how we provide advice, ranking from top impact to bottom impact, I think helps decision making and development of budget bids with that clarity. And this last one actually is my favourite reflection. I think just be patient. Everyone's at different points in time on their evidence journey. Some programs are building the evidence base for the first time, and there's value in that. Some are applying evidence and learning about something they've done before, having a better or communicating a better understanding of what it's delivering for government, and that's good too. But not everyone's at the optimal yet, and I think being patient that everyone's moving in the right direction if they're reporting on outcomes. Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks. Like others today, I'd like to just echo the acknowledgement of country and these beautiful lands we're meeting on. So I'm going to take you through a very quick past, present and future description of what we've been doing in the ACT to support embedding wellbeing. For those who have listened to this before, thanks for listening in again. I won't go over slide for slide. Oh, I've got to press the button, sorry guys. There we go. So I won't go over the slide for slide, but what I really wanted to talk you through was probably we took an approach where we implemented some really core wellbeing actions within our cabinet and budget processes really quickly. And so from 2021, we required a wellbeing impact assessment, which really works through what's at the heart of a proposal going to government, whether it's through asking Cabinet for a decision or asking for the expenditure of money on a service or a program. And so in some ways, I describe this a little bit like habit stacking. So we linked a new way of asking the public service to think about impact and who's going to be involved with a whole range of sort of practices and processes that they were already used to doing. So I think by attaching the kind of new, at that point, wellbeing way of thinking into the public service and the business of government, we really connected with existing ways of doing things. And I think that really helped us build some really quick momentum. We just universally rolled it out. We had and we still have a really strict kind of exemption process. Otherwise, when we say, every proposal going to Cabinet, every business case going to our expenditure review committee has a wellbeing assessment done to support it, that's genuinely the case. And so what I probably want to talk you through a little bit is how we've evolved that in the years since the introduction. So in our present sense, what we're doing at the moment and have done in recent years is really try to reflect and learn after each budget cycle. I'll focus today's discussion on the budget side rather than the Cabinet side. But what we've done in recent years is introduce a small number of wellbeing priorities to really inform the Expenditure Review Committee at the beginning of a budget cycle around what are we seeing in the wellbeing space that's happening. Is there different undercurrents? What's the data showing us? What have we learnt since last budget that's really going to be important for decision makers to think about in this coming budget cycle? We've strengthened expectations in the way that we articulate and ask drafters to articulate what's the impact on future generations. It's incredibly important to be able to articulate what the impact is right now on wellbeing and in the immediate term. What's the long-term implication of this? And we've also, at the same time, really focused on trying to build that internal capability to measure wellbeing outcomes. And that's always going to be, I think, as Matt and others have reflected on, an ongoing journey that doesn't happen overnight. But what we really wanted to do was sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. Bear with me. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to rush, and that's never a good way to talk. We've really focused on sort of looking at how we build the capability within our public service to really start to think and understand around upstream and downstream wellbeing impacts and investments, thinking about whether we're addressing something that's got a preventative focus and we understand the root cause of something, or whether we're dealing with an immediate need. And there's always going to be a need for us to do both, but again, reflecting on trying to get that articulation and that reflection right so that we understand where those investment decisions are being made. So that brings us to our robust evidence base. You can't assess these types of things without having a robust evidence base. And each year, thanks to our research partnerships, we're developing that better and deeper understanding of what these differences in wellbeings look like for different Canberrans, what's driving those differences. But we do often reflect that we feel like we're building the plane while we're flying it. We know we need better evidence. We know it takes time to gather it and develop it. But we also know we need to act right now to secure better wellbeing outcomes. And so we've really been thinking through how we create an openness, or on the flip side, remove barriers that really get in the way of sharing information. We often think in the ACT, if we can't get it right here, where can we get it right? But I don't want to diminish the challenge that I think a lot of us have reflected on in government around the nature of siloed and, in some cases, protective thinking that just naturally exists between directorates. And so really focused at the moment on really breaking down and creating the enabling environment to support really bigger and better data sharing. That brings us into our future space. And so this is one where I think we all recognise that we need to move towards thinking about what I kind of think of as the nuts and bolts of shared accountability, and that to truly shift wellbeing outcomes, especially for those in our communities that are facing entrenched and persistent disadvantage, we're going to have to promote shared ownership and support for integrated responses to these complex challenges. We need to adjust our system-level approaches to performance reporting and strategic planning. These things sound really governmenty, and they are, but they have real-world impacts and implications. So in a practical sense, this means moving beyond that siloed responsibility, recognising that no single portfolio or agency can solely be responsible for shifting outcomes, and really, too many pieces of paper and I've got to wrap up in 2 seconds. So really recognising that there's so much interconnection. So that also includes fostering a shared sense of ownership. We need our agencies to work together. We need them to share data, to coordinate action, and we need to integrate our accountability structures, but it doesn't mean we expect one agency to suddenly have, responsibility for, every outcome across government, but we need to work together and identify a small number of spaces where there's real value in integrating our work together. So that's what I'm going to end on, because I'm conscious we're 3 minutes from time and we want some questions, so thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. I think I feel very privileged to be in Australia, where we have an incredible public service working on really complex policy issues, and we're right in the midst of that sort of implementation phase where it gets really tricky, and there's so many ways to approach it, and there's so many kind of wicked problems that rear up through that process. So it's great to know we're in great hands, and there's a lot of deep thinking about how we approach these challenges. So on that, I might ask our first initial question, and then we'll jump into the Slido, because I can see we've got lots of questions that have come through. I'm interested to hear from a few of you, or each of you, about what your future vision is at maybe that higher level of all of your frameworks and approaches, as sort of in the next 5 years, or if you look ahead, what would be your vision for the future?
Working? That's my favourite question, because I do think if you try and take this to its logical end state, it's pretty far from where we are, but it's not that we're not on the right journey. So I think, absolute dream would be that you had a national framework that was pretty comprehensive, that really beautifully cascaded down to states and territories and then local governments, so we were all kind of working the same direction. And the way we've sort of sprung up a bit more organically than that means we're not perfectly aligned. We can probably wrestle ourselves into a bit more alignment over time. But the other bit of the end state that I would love to see is, say you did get to the point where it was a slightly richer set of indicators that we tracked and they came down to a slightly more granular level. The ability for community to interface with it would be the absolute dream. Look, I think maybe 5 years might be too ambitious. It's actually quite an expensive thing to do. But I do think potentially with the involvement of AI, over time we will get to a point where it's actually quite easy to interface with really big complex data sets, and you might be able to say, in my area, how does this aspect of health compare to the rest of Australia? And then use that as an ability to advocate out to your community, to community leaders to say, hey, I don't think we're tracking so well on these things. I think we could invest more in this. And that's the sort of end state I think we're all collectively working to, even if it's a bit of a messy, windy road that we're on.
I had a great conversation during the break about what's the role of business in government wellbeing frameworks. And I think this, for me, ideal state is framework is useful for internal government decision making, and decision makers see it as something that they need to look at during their deliberations. So it's useful for government decision makers, it's useful for the public service and gives them a hook to work together, but also that it has a particular meaning out for civil communities, for businesses, not necessarily in their day-to-day, may be something they look at once a year when they do their corporate plans. I don't know what the right answer is on that, but that's my kind of ideal state. Is it's a tool that multiple stakeholders and players can use and a hook to bring different people together.
I think the dream has been presented. But I think one of the barriers but opportunities, I know there's work underway and 5 years might be the right time frame, is data linkage between Commonwealth, state, lower levels. I think if that can be done, we can all be working for common evidence base and common tracking. I think it's really powerful. Lots of exciting opportunities. I think there's more opportunities around vertical fiscal balance and having those discussions based on more evidence. Yes, I did say that. The individual's budget decision making, better evidence and showing the benefits that accrue at all levels. And I think even at a practitioner level, trusting that the data is safe. I think there are learnings from past cohorts or similar people experiencing difficulties that can be learned and be applied at that lower level as well. So if we can get that data linkage, and this is very much one for the team through all levels, I think that'd be fantastic and would really help make that framework, that dream, come to life.
Yeah, I think for me, my dream is to have a really well-developed evidence base that enables us to do what I sort of often think of as smooth handovers and transfers. So when we think about some of those really intractable wellbeing challenges that we see people in our community experiencing, it's often through the lens of one agency helping an individual here, then another agency over here is helping, and another one over here is helping. And there's a huge amount of commitment and effort and passion that goes into that. But it's often left to the individual to try and navigate those interactions with government services on their own. And I'd love a really mature evidence base that lets us do much smoother transitions and handovers where they're sort of centred around people rather than around government, the ease for government, the ease for the person. So, but that requires that huge data linkage piece and the real developing, I think, those local understandings of what your community data is showing you. And so maybe 5 years is too soon, but I'm going to keep that as my vision point.
Great. So the most popular question that has come through is, what are some of the ways to ensure the sustainability of wellbeing frameworks and approaches, particularly given government priorities will always shift and change? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. In New South Wales, we actually did kick off this work before the current government came in. But at the time, under a coalition government, we called it a stewardship framework, an economic stewardship framework. So we didn't use the word wellbeing because it was a little bit controversial at the time. So I think the underlying work is very similar. You can kind of repackage it a little bit, depending on who's in power and what they're interested in. So in that sense, you know, I'm not too pessimistic about the durability of these frameworks. But the second point is when we were designing the New South Wales outcomes, we deliberately kept them very high level because we thought that would be much more likely to endure, because they're things that, it doesn't matter what party you're in, they're things that the community and others kind of very intuitively say these are good outcomes. So in that way, the end goals, I think, are enduring. So maybe part of it is, just the way that we talk about. Yeah. But also, I think coming back to that point about evidence, and if it is useful, it is more likely to keep going. So it'll build its own momentum and support over time.
So I did ask a question along this line after the movie last night when we were talking about Scotland and how they have got been on much of a longer journey than any of us have in Australia, I think. And it sounds like there's sort of two components to that answer, and one is definitely this bit of how do you make it part of the systems and processes and part of the furniture, but the other one is the kind of how do you win the hearts and minds all through really not just the political leaders who kind of champion this work and steward it in the initial stages, but so it gets right into the DNA of the bureaucrats who will need to take it forward, and the public sector and all the people who need to be invested in it to keep the dream alive. So that's an interesting bit that I don't think we talk so much about the winning hearts and minds element, but definitely the building it into systems and processes so you almost can't get away from it seems to be part of the answer.
Yeah, I've also been reflecting, I guess, in the wellbeing space more internationally. There tends to be some really, and I don't use this in a negative way, but some really prescriptive ways of entrenching wellbeing within the way that government works, and some really devolved ways. And I think reflecting on probably getting it into the furniture, getting it into just the everyday business of government, so that it's not a question, it's not an argument, it's not do I have to do this. It's we're so used to thinking about the way we do business through this lens that it becomes less of a football. I can say that though, in all honesty, in the ACT with an incredibly stable government, and it gives us a really different perspective on how you achieve some of that. So,
2 words: feedback loops. I think that really helps change what is the budget, which can be seen as a one-off decision-making process, to an overlapping set of decisions. And I think we were very conscious in the framework in Victoria around reporting back each year ahead of the budget. There was also a invest to reinvest model, which puts funding aside in the next budget to continue that momentum. So treating it as a journey rather than just a one-off event, I think, is really important. It's not just important for making it ongoing as a structure or a system or an institution, but also just as a way of working and building trust as a culture piece as well. I think is really important. So feedback loops.
That's great, thank you. This next question, it's worded specifically to measuring what matters, but I think it's relevant to all of you, and it's kind of leading on from that discussion, but more specific. So what kind of legislative hook can ensure that measuring what matters, or your framework, it can ensure it's embedded in government to drive change?
I feel like Suzanne would do a better job of answering this as our resident guru on legislative and regulatory hooks. Look, I think there's a few options about whether you try and make it more specific in some of our things like the Public Service Act and the Commissioner's directions for the Australian Public Service. So you've got all these options available to you. The bit that I am always really interested in is whether they'll actually shift the dial, because quite often the legislative hooks they can end up in ticker box, or they can end up as like a template as part of your budget thing. And I'm really interested in which ones actually make a difference. So I think we've probably got a lot to learn from others who've sort of tracked down this journey a bit before. We're certainly exploring all of those options at the moment. But, happy to take advice if that question was asked with a specific thought in mind about how you think it could be embedded.
So in the ACT, we've taken an interesting approach. We've looked for opportunities to leverage existing pieces of legislation. So this is going to sound really strange, but one of the opportunities we took very early on, and I believe it came into force on the 1st of January 2021, was we changed a component within our freedom of information laws to ensure that for cabinet decisions there's a wellbeing impact summary that gets published as part of our, I forget the actual term that's used, but that was one avenue where we went, you know what, there's an existing piece of legislation, you can obviously go down a long journey of trying to introduce a full new piece of legislation, but where have we got those existing mechanisms that we can change that help us achieve those outcomes? One of the other things we also talk about is legislation's one pathway, but what other accountability mechanisms do we have to drive that continuity? And so, we in our team look at some, interesting things like what does a line in an executive performance agreement look like, for our heads of agencies? What does that look like for branches in part of their work plan? So lots of, I guess a full spectrum is what I'd encourage people to think about and get creative. It doesn't always have to be we're kind of one and done unless we have a fully legislated under a wellbeing kind of heading.
Yeah, it's a little bit similar in Victoria. We got a really nice compliment a while back, and the person who gave these presentations in the room when we got it, which was, isn't this providing awards for things departments should be doing anyway? And that was a great compliment. Don't really take that to heart. But a lot of what's in the legislation and the operating framework for our budget is what's in EAF around quantification, causality, program logic. And this is just like the theory or the legislation, putting it into practice. But to put things into practice, things need to be useful. And this is more of a revealed preference argument. In Victoria, departments and ministers need to volunteer their bids. They need to see value in telling the story through outcomes reporting. And if it wasn't useful for them as well, it wouldn't keep putting new proposals in. But departments and ministers do. There's been growth over the years, and you can see that reflected in as a subset of what's actually funded in government as well.
So the next question's from Ben from NCOS, and it's specific for Xuan, but I think also there could be reflections across the whole panel. So what's the biggest challenge you're facing in the next stage of embedding the framework, and how can people from outside of government help overcome it? Great question for this room, I think.
I feel like there are so many challenges. What's the biggest challenge? At the moment, I feel like that what we struggle with, there's probably kind of two parts to this. One is there are certain policy areas where, as an economist or as a policymaker, you feel like the policy decision doesn't make sense because the evidence tells you something doesn't work, and yet we keep doing the silly thing. And I feel like in that instance, the challenge is we have the evidence, but somehow the evidence is not enough to influence the decision makers. So I think the challenge there is how can we use the wellbeing framework and the framing to shift that narrative and have encourage a different way of having that conversation. I think that's beyond just a wellbeing framework challenge. I think that's a big policy challenge, but I feel like as the wellbeing kind of team and as Treasury, we have a really big opportunity to ask some questions and to get some of those discussions started. So the thing, and just to make it a bit more concrete, I feel like the things that don't make a lot of sense to me are, why we lock up kids in youth detention when we know that doesn't really give you the wellbeing outcomes that we're looking for. But we know that doesn't work, but somehow we still do it. And then the second challenge is kind of the opposite, not quite opposite problem, but the other side of the coin is there are genuinely some policy areas where we don't have a strong evidence base, or we have evidence, but it's not at the level of kind of rigorousness that we as a Treasury might expect to see. And there are reasons for why that may be the case. So again, using the youth justice example, we know that governments are interested in place-based interventions. So, your local youth centres, your swimming pools in remote communities. However, there's a scalability problem there. Like, we know that some things that work in certain communities may not work in other communities. So when we are trying to give advice about, it would be really great to do more early intervention programs, we don't currently have the evidence to say this particular intervention will work in this instance or with this cohort or under these conditions. So I think that's a challenge as well, where, one spot we have the right, what I think we already have the right evidence, but it's not getting to the decisions. And then the other part is, not having the evidence that we'd like to have. And that, again, building that capacity and the maturity of the evidence base itself.
Take it down. I'll be the roving mic. No, you're fine.
Thank you for raising what you just talked about, Nicole, because I think that's where I was going to, and I probably want to be a little bit provocative, but recognising, I want to say at the outset, I do know we need evidence. But we've also heard the last couple of days that many of the things that we need to do are things where we need to just start. We're working with complexity. It means we don't have the evidence, we never will. But if we don't do them, we stay in the same state that we're in. And so what would it take from a Treasury perspective to actually move to a point where we can just acknowledge that there's some money that needs to be spent to change things, that we can still track and monitor and build the evidence, but that doesn't require that beforehand? Because at the moment, I think there is a greater burden on promotion and prevention to actually get some new funding. Yet we also know, and that's what I love that you've mentioned, that the biggest buckets of money are already in things that we know are not evidence-based, but we keep funding growth in them, not just even funding at the same levels, we keep funding growth in them. And we look at who they service, but we don't look at who they don't service. So I'm really interested in, multiple Treasury perspectives of what would it take to shift to think about those things. Thank you.
I'll dive in because I've got the pleasure of not actually working in the ACT Treasury. I work actually out of the Chief Minister's Policy and Cabinet Division. But one of the things that I really think about in that example is the benefit of two past business cases where you go to government and say, we know we need to do some work here. We might not have the existing evidence that stacks up to really back this in, but we'll come back to you after a period of time. But we'll design a really good model up front that enables us to know whether this intervention, for example, does deliver those outcomes that we're expecting it to. And I think that's certainly an approach that makes sense to me around how you provide space in areas where there's not necessarily a really strong existing evidence base that can be drawn upon.
This might be repeating what you've heard before, Monica, but I think, so Eve and I know we had to conversate, creating that evidence, that minimum standard around outcomes of order cost, then building on it from there, and that provides a scale-up pathway. Government, in Eve framework, we try to provide advice on 3 to 4 years of funding for programs. That gives time for them to report on their outcomes so you can understand whether they're working. And I think that can lead to a starting level, then if that works, and come back for a scale-up. And I think that's the steady growth. Sometimes I think you described a big change situation, but sort of taking a breath, building in the integrity and rigour, and then scaling up from there. So I think this is probably the successful path that we've observed.
Yeah, can I put a bit of an optimistic spin? Because I think we should give Treasuries a bit of credit. Because I reckon where they do, they can see a burning platform, they can see a big problem and it's a complex problem, they accept that there might not be any easy answers. I reckon we should also get a bit more creative and sophisticated in terms of thinking about what evidence we can draw on in the world. And one of the languages that Treasuries are very good at understanding is modelling and forecasting. And that's something you can still do. If you say, look, we've got this big problem, I don't know if anyone's ever got under the hood of modelling and forecasting. It's a bunch of assumptions. That's all you can do. That's how you model. That's how you model a path forward. If you can work with those sort of evidence generators and really buddy up with them and say, here's what I'm trying to do. I see a big problem here. I think we've got a solution. I think it would work this way. I suspect if we could roll this out, it would move this many people out of youth justice back into schools. Think about what that tells us from an economic perspective. That can be really powerful evidence speaking to treasuries in the same language, but part of it is we need to kind of connect up and partner in different ways so that we start to kind of deal with that speaking different languages translation issue. But it's not that I don't think treasuries are receptive. They're actually, as much as many economists will have a bit of a natural hierarchy of evidence in their head, they'll accept that understanding that you need to just hit the best possible evidence, that where you don't have a lovely systematic review telling you that across multiple countries in multiple settings this thing works, that you have to keep working backwards until you've got the best possible solution for your context. So it's just a voice of optimism.
I think that what surprised me when I first kind of joined Treasury was that from the outside, you kind of assume that for all of the programs that we regularly spend a lot of money on as a government, that we have this body of evidence that it works, but actually we really don't have that. And a lot of times, for any given year, the number of budget proposals that go through a Treasury, we may only see like half of them have a business case. And you'd expect all of them to have business cases above a certain threshold, but in practice, it doesn't always happen. And there are lots of reasons for that. Sometimes, you may have a minister who has an idea and asks the department to pull together a business case with almost no time. Or it may be that for a particular idea, we haven't kind of got the evidence base behind it, and so it's more a program logic or a theory of change. When I say evidence, I'm not talking even about CBAs or quantification. I'm just talking about what is the problem you're trying to solve and how do you think this proposal is going to solve that problem. So I feel like when I say evidence, is actually a very kind of low base that we're starting from in many ways. There are definitely pockets where we're very mature, but there are pockets in government where we don't have very much at all. So I feel like it's not necessarily about how do we hit this super high level of standard for intervention programs. It's actually asking existing programs to show us that they work as well. So then it's what are you competing against in that budget bid? And I think this comes a little bit back to a question from yesterday about why do we obsess over quantification. It's not that Treasury necessarily wants to see everything turned into a monetary value. It's just that when you have a process of rationing, there's a certain competitiveness built into that. And so if there are some proposals that have numbers and some that don't, even if Treasury is convinced, like the decision makers may not be. So it's not always a versus Treasury thing. It's a how do you convince all the stakeholders.
Great, thank you. I'd love to add to the conversation about Treasury modelling, but we're right on time, so unfortunately, I can't. There are so many amazing questions in here, so I expect you guys might be a little busy in the afternoon tea break. So yeah, please reach out for any questions that we missed. But yeah, we're right on time. Thank you so much for your presentations.